It began like most stories in tightly controlled neighborhoods do, under the shadow of an HOA board and the suffocating rules they impose. The community was pristine, rows of homes painted in approved shades of beige and white, lawns trimmed to perfection, hedges shaped like identical cubes. It was the kind of place where conformity wasn't just expected, it was demanded. And in this little kingdom of manicured order lived the self-proclaimed enforcer of all things proper, a woman everyone had come to know by one name only, Karen. Karen wasn't just any HOA board member. She was the kind who carried a clipboard at all times, who peered through blinds to catch the smallest violations, who seemed to believe that the community streets and driveways belonged to her alone. Residents avoided confrontation with her when they could, quietly paying fines for unsightly trash bins, or improper holiday decorations, anything to escape her constant scrutiny. But no one yet realized how far she was willing to go, until the day she set her sights on the wrong vehicle. At the edge of the neighborhood, tucked neatly into a driveway, sat a dark-colored Jeep. It wasn't flashy, but it had a certain presence, rugged, imposing, with reinforced bumpers and tinted windows. It wasn't parked illegally, nor was it obstructing anyone's property. But in Karen's mind, it was an eyesore. She had complained before about vehicles that didn't fit the aesthetic of the subdivision, targeting pickup trucks, motorcycles, and anything that didn't gleam like a showroom model. And now, in her ever-growing obsession with enforcing community standards, she decided the Jeep had to go. What Karen didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood knew, was that the Jeep didn't belong to a random resident. It belonged to an undercover police task force officer who lived quietly in the community. The Jeep was more than just transportation, it was equipped with specialized gear, hidden compartments, and surveillance tools. It was a working vehicle for high-risk operations, disguised to look like an ordinary civilian ride. And by tampering with it, Karen wasn't just breaking HOA guidelines, she was crossing into federal crime territory. The officer, who often came and went at odd hours, kept the Jeep parked in the driveway when it wasn't in use. It drew Karen's suspicion immediately. She noted the dark tint, the heavy-duty tires, the reinforced locks. To her, it screamed non-compliance. Instead of asking questions, instead of seeking clarification, she convinced herself it was some sort of violation against the neighborhood's sacred image. She scribbled notes in her binder, muttered about setting an example, and began plotting how to correct the situation. Karen's first move was to issue one of her infamous notices. She taped it boldly to the Jeep's windshield, an orange slip declaring it a nuisance vehicle that must be removed within 72 hours. The officer saw it, shook his head, and tossed it in the trash. He had bigger concerns than dealing with the petty crusades of an HOA board member. But Karen wasn't the type to back down when ignored. If anything, being dismissed only fueled her determination. On the third night, just after midnight, she made her move. Armed with bolt cutters she had borrowed under the pretense of yard maintenance, she crept across the driveway under the cover of darkness. Cameras from nearby homes caught her silhouette crouched by the Jeep, wrestling with the heavy lock on its security chain. She grunted and strained until the metal gave way with a sharp snap. In her mind, this was a victory, a triumph of order over defiance. She dragged the chain aside and tugged open the driver's side door, fumbling with the ignition in hopes of moving the vehicle. What she didn't expect was the immediate blare of an alarm, loud and piercing, shattering the quiet of the night. Floodlights snapped on across the driveway. The Jeep wasn't just protected, it was wired with a security system designed for high-value equipment. Neighbors peeked through their windows, startled, as Karen froze in the spotlight, caught red-handed with bolt cutters still clutched in her hands. But even then, she didn't panic. She believed she could talk her way out of it, claimed she was enforcing HOA regulations, and that the vehicle was improperly stored. Within minutes, the officer emerged from his home, calm but calculating. He didn't confront her directly, not yet. Instead, he quietly took note of her actions, the lock she had cut, the tools she carried. He knew this wasn't just a petty HOA dispute anymore, it was tampering with government property. And while the neighbors whispered about Karen's latest overstep, he remained silent, already considering how to escalate the situation properly. Karen strutted away from the Jeep as though she had achieved some grand accomplishment. To her, this wasn't theft or destruction of property, it was community enforcement. She believed the board would back her up, that the HOA's authority trumped individual complaints. She had no idea she had just crossed into dangerous territory, one where her beloved bylaws held no power. The next morning, she doubled down. With the arrogance only she could muster, she emailed the entire neighborhood about her successful intervention, warning others that non-compliant vehicles would not be tolerated. She even hinted at plans to have the Jeep towed permanently. Her words stirred resentment among residents who had grown weary of her antics, but few dared to confront her openly. They didn't yet realize how high the stakes truly were, or how quickly her actions would backfire. The officer, meanwhile, was already making calls. Quiet, discreet, but decisive. He explained the situation to his task force supervisor, who immediately flagged it as a potential breach of security. The Jeep contained sensitive technology, tools that could compromise operations if mishandled. Karen's intrusion had triggered not just a local issue but an official review. What began as an HOA squabble was now on the radar of law enforcement agencies who didn't take kindly to civilians cutting into their equipment. And yet, Karen remained blissfully unaware. She walked the neighborhood that afternoon, smug and self-satisfied, boasting about restoring order. To her, it was just another victory against what she saw as defiance. She didn't realize that each step she took brought her closer to consequences far beyond the petty power struggles of HOA politics. She had started a chain of events she could no longer control, and the fallout was only beginning to unfold. Because in the world outside of HOA newsletters and bylaws, there are rules with real weight. And tampering with federal property isn't a fine you can pay off with a check to the association. It's a crime that demands accountability. Karen had cut through a lock that wasn't just guarding a Jeep, it was guarding a line she should never have crossed. And soon, she would learn that lesson in the most public, humiliating way imaginable. The morning after Karen's midnight operation against the Jeep, the neighborhood simmered with whispers. Security footage from several homes had already circulated quietly in group chats, showing her crouched in the shadows with bolt cutters, the alarm blaring, the lights snapping on. Some residents shook their heads in disbelief, others chuckled nervously at the audacity, but no one dared confront her directly. They had seen her wrath before, endless fines, letters, petty vendettas, and most preferred to stay out of her way. Karen, however, walked with her head held higher than ever. She believed she had struck a blow for community order. She treated the entire ordeal as proof of her authority, a demonstration of how the HOA could bend even the most stubborn homeowner to its will. She expected praise, support, and perhaps even a commendation at the next board meeting. What she didn't expect was silence, tight-lipped neighbors refusing to applaud her, subtle glances exchanged behind her back, and a creeping sense that she had stirred something larger than she understood. Meanwhile, the Jeep's owner was already working behind the scenes. He wasn't just a resident with an unusual vehicle. He was part of an undercover police task force, and his Jeep wasn't simply transportation, it was outfitted with surveillance systems, encrypted communications, and sensitive equipment that couldn't fall into the wrong hands. Karen's reckless act of cutting the lock wasn't viewed as a petty nuisance, it was catalogued as tampering with government property. And tampering with government property was a crime. The officer filed his report with precision, providing time-stamped video evidence, photographs of the damaged lock, and even copies of Karen's neighborhood-wide emails bragging about her enforcement. His supervisor escalated the matter quickly, looping in both local authorities and federal contacts. Within days, what Karen thought was a neighborhood dispute had transformed into an investigation that reached far beyond the HOA's reach. Yet in Karen's insulated bubble of control, she remained unaware. She spent her days parading around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, making notes about minor infractions, garden hoses left visible, lawn gnomes deemed non-standard, garbage bins rolled out a few hours early. To her, the Jeep incident was already in the past, a closed case of violation resolved. But each step she took was shadowed by an officer who watched, waited, and prepared to move when the time was right. The tension escalated quietly at first. Two unmarked vehicles began to appear on the street at odd hours. Karen noticed them but dismissed them as visiting relatives. She failed to recognize the subtle signs of surveillance, parked cars with barely visible antennae, strangers taking slow walks past her house, clipboards of a very different kind carried by men and women who weren't her neighbors. Her first hint of real trouble came at the next HOA board meeting. She strutted in, armed with her binder, expecting applause, signs of surveillance, parked cars with barely visible antennae, strangers taking slow walks past her house, clipboards of a very different kind carried by men and women who weren't her neighbors. Her first hint of real trouble came at the next HOA board meeting. She strutted in, armed with her binder, expecting applause for removing a dangerous vehicle from the neighborhood aesthetic. Instead, she was met with an uncomfortable silence. A few board members exchanged wary glances. One timidly asked if perhaps she had gone too far, cutting locks in the middle of the night. Karen bristled at the suggestion, snapping that she had authority under community guidelines. But authority under community guidelines meant nothing against the kind of authority now focused on her. The officer remained quiet, letting her words hang in the air, catalogued by those who would later subpoena every detail. He knew people like Karen thrived on power and attention, but what she didn't realize was that the walls were already closing in. By the end of the week, Karen received an official notice, not from the HOA, but from law enforcement. It was delivered discreetly, left at her front door in an envelope that bore no association letterhead. Inside was a formal request for questioning, citing possible tampering with private property and potential interference with government equipment. Karen's confidence wavered for the first time. She tried to laugh it off, insisting to herself that it was a mistake, that the Jeep man must have exaggerated. But the tone of the letter was cold, precise, and unmistakably serious. Her reaction followed a familiar pattern. Instead of stepping back, instead of seeking counsel or admitting error, she doubled down. She marched through the neighborhood the next morning, loudly declaring that she was being harassed for simply doing her job. She sent more emails, long-winded tirades accusing the Jeep's owner of being a rule breaker, and suggesting that law enforcement was wasting its time. Each message only added fuel to the fire, painting a clearer picture of her reckless defiance. The residents began to distance themselves. Neighbors who once tolerated her no longer waved. Parents pulled their children inside when she passed. Group chats buzzed with speculation. What had she really done? Why were police circling the neighborhood, and how deep was she in trouble? Karen, blinded by her own self-importance, assumed it was jealousy. In reality, it was fear. No one wanted to be associated with the woman who had cut through a lock that belonged not just to a man, but to a task force. The investigation tightened. Officers visited the Jeep discreetly, inspecting for tampering. They photographed the damaged lock, collected the severed chain, and filed everything as evidence. They also pulled copies of Karen's public boasts, emails, recorded HOA speeches, even notes she had posted on community bulletin boards. The paper trail painted a damning picture of intent. Still, Karen walked with pride, clinging to the belief that HOA bylaws somehow shielded her from accountability. She didn't grasp the enormity of what she had done, that in her obsession with neighborhood aesthetics, she had stepped into a world governed not by HOA fines but by criminal codes. The final turning point came late one evening, when two officers in plain clothes knocked on her door. They weren't aggressive. They were polite, professional, calm. But their presence sent a ripple through the entire street. Curtains twitched. Lights flickered on in nearby homes. Everyone knew what it meant. Karen, who had built her identity on controlling others, now found herself under someone else's control. They handed her paperwork. She skimmed it, her confidence faltering as words like tampering, property damage, and criminal investigation leapt from the page. Still, she tried to bluff, insisting she was acting under HOA authority, that she had every right. But the officers remained unmoved. They explained, in clipped, professional tones, that HOA rules do not override state or federal law. That cutting locks and attempting to access vehicles was not enforcement, but vandalism. And that the Jeep was not just a vehicle, but government property. Karen's face paled. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down. But her pride wouldn't let her back down. She signed nothing, admitted nothing, and stood tall even as the officers departed with a warning that further action was imminent. The neighborhood buzzed for days afterward. Residents whispered about charges, about possible arrests, about whether Karen would finally be stripped of her precious HOA authority. Some pitied her. Most didn't. They had lived under her thumb for too long, and now they watched with a mixture of relief and anticipation as her empire began to crumble. And yet, in the silence of her home, Karen clung to denial. She convinced herself it would blow over, that she was untouchable. She didn't see what everyone else could, that this was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was law enforcement preparing to make an example of her. The stage was set for the final reckoning. By the time the third week rolled around, the tension in the neighborhood was impossible to ignore. The pristine streets, once ruled by Karen's constant patrols, felt strangely quiet. She still made appearances, clipboard in hand, but the air of authority she once commanded was gone. Neighbors who once cowered now stared openly, whispering in driveways and over fences. Word had spread that she was under investigation, and the rumor mill twisted with each telling. Some claimed she had already been charged. Others whispered that federal agents had her house under surveillance. The truth was somewhere in between. The case against her had grown quietly but steadily, each new piece of evidence stacking higher. The officer whose Jeep she had violated had supplied everything: security footage, photographs, official reports, and even copies of her boastful emails. Every action she thought was a display of power had become proof of recklessness. And as the investigation deepened, it became clear that Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a liability. Still, Karen clung to her delusion of invincibility. At the next HOA meeting, she arrived early, stacking her papers neatly, rehearsing speeches in her head. She expected pushback, yes, but also believed she could spin the narrative, frame herself as a victim, claim harassment, and turn the residents back against the Jeep's owner. She thought she could rally support by leaning on the fear she had cultivated for years. But that night, the boardroom was different. The seats were filled not with timid nods of agreement but with wary silence. A few residents held copies of the police notices she had received, passed to them quietly by neighbors who had seen the plain-clothed officers. The air was heavy with expectation. And when Karen began her speech, long-winded, filled with accusations and self-praise, it fell flat. No applause. No murmurs of agreement. Only cold stares. Then, for the first time, one of the board members spoke up against her. Calmly, directly, without fear. He reminded the room that the HOA was not above the law, that cutting locks and tampering with vehicles was not part of any bylaws. His words hung in the air, and others followed, quiet voices that had been silent for too long. One by one, residents challenged her, exposing her hypocrisy, her bullying, and the chaos she had brought upon them all. Karen's face hardened, her voice rising, her tone sharpening into the shrill edge everyone recognized. But the tide had turned. The power she had wielded so easily for years was gone. And just as her voice reached its highest pitch, the boardroom doors opened. Two uniformed officers stepped inside. The room fell silent. They weren't there to argue or negotiate. They were there with purpose. In calm, professional tones, they announced that they were serving Karen with formal charges: destruction of property, tampering with government equipment, and interference with law enforcement operations. They read each count aloud, their words echoing through the hushed room. And as Karen stood frozen, clutching her clipboard like a shield, the reality of her situation became undeniable. The neighborhood watched in silence. Some recorded discreetly on their phones. Others simply stared, wide-eyed, as the woman who had terrorized them for years finally faced consequences. Karen sputtered, insisting it was a mistake, that she had authority, that she was only protecting community standards. But her protests fell flat. The officers had no interest in HOA politics. They were there for facts, for evidence, for accountability. And the evidence was overwhelming. They didn't handcuff her, not yet. But they escorted her from the meeting, past rows of neighbors who had once avoided her glare. Now they met her eyes directly, unflinching, some even relieved. She walked out with her head still high, but the clipboard trembled in her hands. For the first time, Karen looked small. In the days that followed, the fallout rippled through the neighborhood. The board moved swiftly, stripping her of her position and barring her from further involvement in HOA operations. Residents who had once feared her fines and threats began to breathe freely again. Children played in yards without parents warning them to stay out of her sight. The atmosphere shifted, lighter, freer, as though the community itself had been unshackled. But the legal battle for Karen was only beginning. Her case moved from neighborhood gossip to court filings. Attorneys dissected her actions in sterile detail, laying bare every poor decision, every boastful email, every reckless justification. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as an almost comical cautionary tale of an HOA gone too far. Headlines mocked her arrogance, portraying her as a caricature of control gone wild. For the officer and his task force, the incident was filed away as a security breach resolved. But privately, he admitted it had been a close call. Sensitive equipment could have been compromised, operations jeopardized, all because one woman thought neighborhood bylaws gave her ultimate authority. It was a reminder that real power doesn't come from clipboards or fines, it comes from responsibility. Karen, meanwhile, faced a slow unraveling. The woman who once strutted through the streets now avoided them. Her blinds stayed closed. Her yard, once immaculate, grew wild at the edges, untrimmed hedges and weeds signaling her loss of control. Neighbors passed by with quiet satisfaction, remembering the countless times she had shamed them for minor imperfections. Her empire had collapsed, and all that remained was silence. In the end, the neighborhood moved on. They planted new flowers, painted homes in colors just a shade brighter than the old rules allowed, and gathered for block parties without fear of fines. Life resumed, not perfect, but free. And though Karen remained, she was no longer a force to be reckoned with. She had become a cautionary tale, a whispered story told to newcomers, don't cross the line. Don't be like Karen. Her downfall was complete, not with a single dramatic outburst, but with the steady erosion of fear, the loss of respect, and the arrival of consequences she could never have imagined. Because in the end, power built on control and arrogance can only last so long. And when it collapses, it does so completely, leaving nothing behind but a story for others to learn from. The Jeep remained in the driveway, untouched, a quiet monument to the truth Karen refused to see. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a line she never should have crossed. And for that mistake, she paid a price no HOA title could protect her from.